Today we're going to be dealing with an unsolvable problem. Why do the righteous suffer? The book of Job probably originated in ancient stories dating back as far as 2,000 years before Christ. It is classified as one of the wisdom writings in the Bible. It is not meant to be taken as history, although it may be based on an historical person who became the subject of legend. Most scholars think it was written during or after the period known as the Exile, no later than 250 B.C. Dr. B. Davy Napier, well-known professor of religion and Old Testament, is going to walk us through this difficult book of Job and some of its possible interpretations.
Anyone who tells you they've got the book of Job figured out is, well, let's say they're doing better than most of us. At times, I'm not sure how I feel about Job and what the outcome of his story really means. Let's look first at the text itself, because it can help clear up some of the confusion. If you had trouble following what was going on, don't feel bad. There are reasons. But through biblical study, scholars have been able to break down the different parts of the book and reconstruct the action. Chapters 1 and 2 constitute the prologue. This is where the celestial drama between God and the Satan, in Hebrew Hasatan, take place. And Job is singled out for a kind of test of faith. Chapters 3 through 31 are called the dialogue section. It's more like a courtroom debate than anything else. The speeches run in 3 cycles between Job and his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Toward the end of this section is where the order of things really gets messed up. Bildad's last speech is cut short, and what follows in chapters 26 and 27 is represented as the words of Job, which contradict everything he said earlier. Also attributed to Job is a poem in praise of wisdom, chapter 28, which has no real relationship to the rest of the speeches. Chapters 32 through 37 cover the speeches of Elihu, a young bystander. This section is also considered either a later addition or misplaced. It makes much more sense to move directly from chapter 31, Job's final demand for a chance to plead his case before God, to God's response in chapter 38. Chapter 38 through the first part of chapter 42, verse 6, constitute the Yahweh speeches, or God's reply to Job. The last part of chapter 42, that is verses 7 to 17, contains the epilogue. Now, you may instinctively have felt the difference between the prose of the prologue and epilogue and the poetry of the rest of the book. Even the word used for God is different in these 2 sections. Speculation is that the author of Job adapted the ancient folk tale about Job, which now appears as the prologue and epilogue, in the present book that is. Using this framework, the author then fleshed out the story with magnificent poetry. Clearly, the author's insight into the Job story goes far beyond the ancient folk tale. But since it was an existing piece that people would be familiar with, the author couldn't do too much to change it. This may account for some of the contradictions in the book. But even in these contradictions, there are things to be learned. The God of prologue and epilogue is much more intimate and charming than the sophisticated deity of the Yahweh speeches. And the character of Job himself appears to be made of different stuff. It's in the prologue that we get the popular image of Job as a man of incredible patience. He's a different man in all the poetry that follows. Angry, hurt, demanding some answers. In the speeches of Job and his friends, there are at least a dozen different arguments offered to explain Job's suffering. It's not clear that any one of them comes across as the definitive answer. Let's look at some of the possibilities. A common interpretation of the book is that it refutes the traditional doctrine that righteousness brings prosperity in this life and wickedness brings misfortune. This is the argument of Job's friends. Suffering is a punishment for sin. You're suffering, therefore you must have sinned, even if you aren't aware of what the sin is. Some scholars have suggested that the Job story parallels the story of Israel. There's no indication that this is the author's intent, since the whole history of Israel is ignored in the book. But it was certainly a part of the general background of both reader and author, and may provide a clue to the story's meaning. Both Job and Israel are originally upright and blameless, and have a special relationship with God. Both Job and Israel suffer an incredible sequence of disasters. Job in the loss of his property, family, and health. Israel during the exile. Both protest this treatment, but are called to task by their neighbors. In the end, God rebukes the pride of Job and of Israel, and their restoration comes once again in their taking on the role of servant. It's also possible to expand on this theme of pride as a clue to interpreting the book of Job. In the closing chapters of the dialogue section, Job recalls the days before his tragedy. He lists his works of righteousness and his special relationship with God. But God angrily replies, "Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be justified?" This interpretation makes more sense in combination with the epilogue from the old Job story. Job is told to pray for his friends, and in providing that service, all is restored to him. Job's true fulfillment, indeed everyone's fulfillment, is in abandoning pride and accepting the role of servant. But does this interpretation account for the differences between the speeches and the epilogue? The epilogue seems to confirm what Job has argued against all along, that prosperity is a reward for righteousness. If there is a solution to the problem, most interpreters have found it in what's called the theophany, the appearance of God to Job in the Yahweh speeches. There are difficulties even in this view. Job's challenge does indeed bring a direct response, though God ignores the issue as Job has defined it. There will be no explanation of why Job is suffering. God's answer to Job's challenge is to fling the challenge right back in his face. "Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you declare to me." Is the author's purpose to put Job in his proper place in relation to God? To establish for all of us, for all time, who we are and who's in control here? God never accuses Job of anything more than ignorance. You cannot understand what my purpose is. With that, Job is satisfied. He confesses his error and repents. He has gotten his answer, even if it's not the answer he wants. More than anything else, Job is a person of faith. If there's a solution to the problem of his suffering, perhaps it's in the opportunity he has for a face-to-face encounter with God.